Well, welcome back, everyone. Thank you for joining us at the Wall Street Journal Future of Everything Festival. My name is Almar Latour. I'm the CEO of Dow Jones and the publisher of the Wall Street Journal. It has been a fascinating 2 days of conversations. And I hope that Wall Street Journal gatherings like these will leave you with more insights and more connections and more information, reliable information, to guide you in your decision making, whether that's in business, in policy, or at home at the kitchen table. Now, this event would not be possible without the generous support of our global sponsors. Our presenting sponsors are Google Chrome, the Hartford, Lufthansa, Samsung, Simon Kucher. Our contributing sponsors are Altria, NASDAQ, and our supporting sponsors, the CFA Institute, Comcast Business, and Next Era Leaders. Big hand to them. Now, something close to all of our hearts. Our next session is about the future of journalism itself, specifically press freedom. For us at the Wall Street Journal and all of Dow Jones, as you know, this hits especially close to home as our colleague and Wall Street Journal reporter Evan Gershkovich remains today wrongfully incarcerated in a Russian prison. We have teams working around the clock toward securing his release. And we'll do that no matter how long it takes. Now, as some of you may know, today is World Press Freedom Day. It's a moment to observe the essential function that independent journalism plays in society. Let's all take a moment to contemplate that, because the stakes are incredibly high right now. Without press freedom, there is no free society. Evan's wrongful arrest is a punch in the face of free press. Now, it matters even if you are not in the news business, and here is why. In an era of media overload, quality reporting, quality journalism is at a premium. Every single one of us in this room and beyond, your friends, your family, we all rely on trustworthy information in one way or another. And as it relates to Evan, his reporting offered an important window into one of the world's most isolated countries right now, Russia, a country that we're all seeking to understand right now. Evan was giving it his all. So Evan's wrongful detention is a reminder of the fight that all of us are in, whether you know it or not. It's autocrats versus the pen. Orwellian manipulation of information versus reliable, trustworthy information as a cornerstone of free society. Free press today is under significant threat worldwide. And unfortunately, Evan's case is the latest in what truly is a disturbing trend. Reporters worldwide are harassed, arrested, and much, much worse. The unjust arrest of any reporter anywhere in the world is unacceptable. Now, the fight for their freedom, it's ultimately a fight for your freedom. So before I turn it over to Wall Street Journal Editor-in-Chief Emma Tucker, we'd like to tell you a little bit more about Evan through a video of his family and his colleagues. Thank you again for joining us today.
Did you ever talk to him about what could happen as a journalist in Russia?
No, but I trusted him. I trusted his judgment. Of course, it makes things more difficult for me now because I feel that I've failed in some way as a father.
The family of Wall Street Journal reporter Evan Gershkovich is speaking out for the first time since he was detained in Russia on March 29th.
It was a shock. At the same time, I had this uncertainty and
You have the mother's sixth sense.
Yes, that's why I reached to him on Monday, and on Wednesday he got arrested.
Evan was detained during a reporting trip to Yekaterinburg. He was brought to Moscow and accused of espionage, an allegation the Wall Street Journal, his family, and the U.S. government strongly deny.
We're making it real clear that it's totally illegal what's happening.
For Evan's family, his arrest is the latest chapter in their long and complex history with Russia.
It was just like crushing, totally crushing. That experience all came back from the Soviet Union.
Evan comes from a family of survivors of the Holocaust, of Joseph Stalin's brutal repression, and of anti-Semitism in the Soviet Union. What did it mean for your family to be Jewish in that region at that time?
My mother would put those, which were called soldiers' blankets, so thick, like 2 of them on the windows to light up the candles, so other neighbors wouldn't see that we were, like Jewish or anything like that.
In 1979, Evan's parents Ella and Mikhail fled the Soviet Union separately. They emigrated to America and ended up working together in New York City.
And that's where I met him.
At work?
At work.
Yeah, we merged.
The couple settled in New Jersey and had 2 kids. And while they embraced life in the U.S.,
Happy birthday to you.
They raised Evan and his sister Danielle with the Russian language and Russian traditions. Even taking them back to Russia in 1999.
Our parents raised us to have pride in where we come from. We got to be proud of where we come from and tried to share that as much as we could in school.
At home in the U.S., Evan fell in love with sports and learned to play cello. What do you remember about Evan when he was little?
Very, very curious from early age.
He loved having fun. That was his thing. He always had questions about everything. So he just has this need to know, desire to learn deeper and find out meaning in things.
Evan's curiosity and fun-loving spirit would go on to serve him well as a journalist. And colleagues say that his Russian heritage and language skills set him apart from other Russia correspondents when he took his first reporting job in Moscow.
His Russian got insanely good. He was reading books as fast as he could, just downloading Russian culture and getting to that really high fluency level. The passion really developed once he was there and really immersed and kind of discovering it. It's also such a different Russia than my parents knew.
Did you notice any changes in him?
He would tell me that he understood certain nuances of what my parents were saying better than he had growing up. He understood a deeper context to it.
Good afternoon, everyone, and we're here together today to mark the 30th anniversary of World Press Freedom Day. To mark the occasion, I'm joined on stage by the New York Times' Joe Kahn, Irene Khan, no relation, from the United Nations, and NBC's Andrea Mitchell. Now, on Saturday at the White House Correspondents' Dinner, President Biden stood in front of a very large picture of Evan Gershkovich and declared the free press to be a pillar, if not the pillar, of a free society, certainly not the enemy. Now, these were stirring words from the President of the United States, but I think we can all acknowledge that the press is under pressure, that the situation has become somewhat fragile. So, Joe, I wanted to start by asking you, do you think the free press is something that we have perhaps taken for granted for too long. And to what extent do you think it's now under threat?
I do think it's something we have taken for granted, actually, for most of my career as a journalist, which began, in the 1980s, which happened to coincide with a period of the end of the Cold War, the opening of the world to, a sense of Western-led or Western-style globalization, liberalization, the decline of the Soviet Union, the spread of American power. And I think many others assumed that we were in a long arc period toward greater press freedom, greater openness economically, liberalization politically at a faster or slower speed, and the free press is integral to that process. And in the last, 5 years or decade, I think we've seen many of those assumptions shaken pretty fundamentally. And I'm afraid that Evan's case is a very clear illustration of that threat.
So, Irene, I wanted to ask you, why does it matter? Why does it matter that the free press is under pressure?
I think it matters because the free press is a fundamental pillar of democracy. We see democracy spreading around the world. We've seen that happen. And wherever press is being suppressed, that is where we see democracy retreating. We see democracy retreating in established democracies like India and Turkey. We see democracy retreating in emerging freedom of press retreating in emerging democracies in a number of other countries. And along with that, we see a tightening, a stronger grip of authoritarian regimes. And that is very, very dangerous because these regimes have figured out that if you want to kill freedom, if you want to kill free society, capture the media. And that is what is happening. Capturing, threatening, intimidating journalists is the way they do it. And that is why Evan's case is important. It's important to release Evan as an individual, as a person, as a journalist. But it's also important to do it for the sake of media freedom around the world.
Andrea, you've reported in your career from all over the place, from some countries which I think would probably now be impossible to report from. And it just so happens that the World Press Freedom Annual Rankings were released today, and they concluded that journalists are operating in poor environments in 7 out of every 10 countries. What do you think the longer-term implications for organisations like ours and yours are for what are the implications for us? How are we going to go about gathering information, reporting the news in the future?
It's extraordinarily challenging, and nothing illustrates that more vividly and terrifyingly than what's happened to Evan Gershkovich. Just in the case of your colleague and friend, and someone who was universally admired, and wrongfully detained doesn't even begin to describe, the horror of what's happening to him. And it creates a greater challenge for all of us to make sure that people around the world get this information and that people within these communities, within these countries, learn what's happening around them. 1,000 journalists, Russian journalists, have left Russia since the beginning of the war, and we are supplementing that. They are working from, expatriate situations. We are still sending people in, many of our organizations. Those who can't, since Evan's arrest and jailing, are doing it as remotely as they can through Russian nationals and others. And there is an underground movement, but it is so terrifying and challenging and dangerous. I was interviewing just this week for a report that we're airing tonight for World Press Freedom Day, these 3 extraordinary Ukrainian Associated Press journalists who stayed in Mariupol. They went to Mariupol knowing that would be an early target, and they stayed underground with the people there during the siege. And the way they phrased it was, without information, civil society collapses, that they began to see it around them because people were so terrified with no other journalists. They were the only three there. They took those incredible pictures, the images of the pregnant woman on the stretcher being carried out, who died 2 days later. She was 9 months pregnant after the bombing of the maternity ward. Her child as well died. And without that image, the world would not have been as galvanized. And also the people inside would not have had hope for very dangerous escapes that they made from Mariupol. And that's just a microcosm. Mm-hmm. And then the Iranian women, we can discuss in greater depth that how can they get their information out? What is the truth about the poisonings, the alleged poisonings? So it is only through press freedoms that all of us survive. And it's no accident that the First Amendment in the United States is the First Amendment.
Well, it was wonderful to, President Biden absolutely nailed his colours to the mast on Saturday night. But Joe, do you think other governments are doing enough to speak out or to speak up in defence of the free press?
No. And, I think that it's incumbent on essentially every democratic government to speak out forcefully in defense of it. And I worry a little that some of what happened in this country since 2016, which was the incredible polarization accompanied by, kind of the division of the press into camps, makes it easier for other governments around the world to say, see, it's happening there too. You're on one side or the other side as a media organization, and if you're not on my side, I can repress you. And I think the rhetoric that accompanied some of the sort of the political shift in this country was incredibly negative for a sense of sort of an independent press that serves a good to society as a whole by not being partisan, by trying to produce information which is valuable and available to everyone on all sides of a political debate. And I think the fact that there's been as much polarization here as there has been has weakened Biden's message and has weakened the signal to would-be democratic countries or countries leaning toward a more authoritarian bent that America has a very clear set of values on press freedom. So I do worry, actually, that governments need to do more, but also civil society needs to do more to stand up for the legitimate, independent press, even when you don't agree with everything that's being written, as itself of value to society as a whole and sustaining kind of civil society and open debate.
So, Irene, you're at the United Nations, so obviously, you've got a big global perspective, but the Committee to Protect Journalists, they issued a report a few weeks ago that it actually criticised the European Union, saying that the institution wasn't speaking up enough in defence of a free press, largely because it's covering for some regimes that haven't supported the free press. Poland, Hungary are two that spring to mind. I mean, do you agree that they should be more robust, or do you think or do you think there's a problem in Europe?
I think there's a major problem in all democratic countries. The reason why the authoritarian regimes feel emboldened now to move the way they are moving, crushing free speech. There is no independent media at all in Russia, but Russia is not the only country that has that kind of problem. There are a number of others in almost every region. And that is happening because those who have championed human rights do not today champion media freedom. They do not understand the real value of media, which goes way beyond just a human right or freedom of expression. It's actually an institution, a pillar of democracy. And I am very worried that trade, strategic concerns, all sorts of other issues of political interest, commercial interest, business interest, predominate the importance of media. Media is not just another form of economic activity. It is actually a public good. It is a human right. We need it if we want to have free societies. That message has to come very strongly down through governments, but also through public opinion. Yesterday, I and my equivalent, my counterparts in the Organization of American States, in the African Union, and in the Organization of Security and Cooperation in Europe, three large regional organizations, we jointly put out a declaration about media freedom because we believe that there is a perfect storm now between authoritarian states, backsliding democracies, and digital technology coming in and creating all kinds of opportunities, yes, for the media, but also very big threats of misinformation, disinformation, and this sort of political polarization that you were speaking. That's a perfect storm that could blow out media freedom with huge implications across. You know, if you notice, when authoritarian regimes kill one journalist or lock one journalist like Evan, it is not just Evan, it chills a lot of others. And the whole sector is being undermined in that way when democratic states don't speak up.
So, talking of authoritarian regimes, Andrea, I know you follow very closely events in Iran. How are we supposed to be able to report from a country like Iran? I mean, as external journalists, but also for people on the ground there, what's it like for them? I know you're in touch with people there. What's it like for them operating on the ground in a country like Iran, where you're literally taking your life into your own hands by trying to report the truth?
It's very challenging. I remember when I was there in 2009 to do an interview with President Ahmadinejad, and they tried to take the tape away from me. They wanted to edit the video before I filed, and I said, well, then we cannot. It was after the interview. And so for 3 hours I stayed, I think it was almost 3 hours, I stayed in the presidential palace, refusing to turn over the tapes. And finally, we called the then president of NBC News, who said, put me on speaker. And he said, if you are not released in the next 2 minutes with your video, we're going to go out and say that NBC's chief foreign affairs correspondent is being held hostage in the presidential palace in Tehran. And so they released me, and we barely made air with a report that night. But it was incredibly intimidating. And just imagine what happens to Iranian nationals. We do have a bureau there. We have a bureau chief who's been there, a veteran correspondent there, Ali Arouzi, who's wonderful, our bureau chief. It's difficult, and we have to always. We talk to a lot of people outside of Iran, people who've come out, but then you always have to try to, get through other filters. So developing sources is tough.
Yeah.
But one of the other problems, I think, is that we in the media have huge interest in stories when the protests are big, and then it retreats, it fades. We have a war in Ukraine. We have difficulties with China. There are so many challenges, and it's upon us to keep the focus on these stories.
Yeah, and I think, to go back to Irene's point about the chilling effect, I know, Joe, like us at the Wall Street Journal, we're thinking very hard about China. I mean, the Evan's arrest has very much focused minds, about the safety of our journalists. But nor do we want to step back from covering the world, reporting what's happening on the ground. Joe, what are the kind of conversations that you're having at the New York Times about how to get the balance between the safety of people on the ground, but still committing to covering a country like China, which I know you know well?
Yeah, it's one of the most delicate conversations we have, because the balance of risk and reward in terms of the journalism that you get out of it is shifting, and you need to be more and more certain that we've had a culture for years of covering conflict, for example, where you take a calculated risk with the right sort of security measures in place, with experienced journalists who are used to conflict, and you take a calculated risk to go into a combat zone for a very limited period of time for a specific story that we sign off on, and then you pull out and you do the story. Unfortunately, foreign correspondence is becoming more and more like that in general, where we have to make decisions about whether it's safe to base somebody in a country full time, to what extent we're comfortable using local journalists as part of our news gathering apparatus and putting them at risk. Local journalists tend to be at greater risk than the traditional foreign correspondent with a passport coming from elsewhere. So to what extent can we rely on them for research and news gathering and photography and sort of even translation can put people at risk. And then the next layer is, when is it safe to send in a foreign correspondent? How long can they stay? Can they be based there the way they once did? That calculus is shifting radically in Russia at the moment because of what happened to Evan. And many organizations, including ours, has stopped permanently basing foreign correspondents in Russia. We'll be making calculated choices about whether or not we can send somebody back in for short periods, but at the moment we would not base somebody permanently there. China, I think, is deteriorated sharply, but not that sharply at the moment. There's a higher risk for local journalists who are working with international organizations. We have not yet seen a Russia-like situation where a foreign journalist is taken hostage or captive and charged with espionage, which would cross a line that China so far hasn't crossed. So we're hoping it doesn't go that far, but the direction of travel is not good.
What about NBC? Do you still have a presence in Russia?
We have a presence in Russia. We send people in from London, and we have a permanent bureau, mostly Russian people, Russian nationals, who have been journalists with us for years, our Russian crew, and they've been able to operate. But it's certainly restricted as to where you can go.
Yeah.
And we don't. They assess each assignment based on whatever the risks, that they can determine. Obviously, Ukraine is the greatest security risk net right now because there's no front line, and you never know.
Yes, exactly. So even before the situation with Evan, I think newsrooms had been grappling with the issue of how to cover a war. The first land war in Europe since goodness knows when, and all the associated risks that go with that. And of course, we're committed to covering it, but it's also a hugely expensive business. I mean, Irene, to what extent do you think the war in Ukraine has changed whether events like Ukraine have changed the calculation that people are making around press freedom?
I think people are beginning to realize how important information is during war. There have been wars in Ethiopia, in other parts of Africa, but somehow it's been too far away. So I think for the Western world, the war in Ukraine is making it very alive for them. Every day you see it, how important information is. And I have in a report I submitted to the UN General Assembly last year, I said that information is a survival right. During war, information is a survival right. It really makes a difference between life and death, having accurate information. And I think we are seeing it every day. I hope governments, democratic governments, will draw some important lessons from that. I believe journalists need more protection than they receive at the moment under international humanitarian law during war. Journalists are treated as civilians, and civilians should not be targeted in war. But journalists are targeted civilians. When you wear a press jacket, I've heard journalists, Ukrainian journalists tell me that when they put on their press jacket, they worry as to whether they become a sniper's target there. Because the very fact that they're carrying a jacket puts them at greater risk. So we need to do more for journalists. I don't think the international community, I don't think governments worldwide are taking that into consideration, how vital journalists are, and the more important news becomes, the more they become targets, because if you want to destroy something, then that you go after journalists, and that's what they're doing. So I hope from Ukraine we will draw some important lessons.
Andrea, what would you like to see in response to these sorts of threats? What would you like to see as a response? I mean, should the US be expelling journalists on foreign journalists, Chinese journalists in retaliation? Or, I mean, how do you think, what tools are there?
I don't think expelling their journalists, although from many of these countries, the journalists are, quote, not real journalists. They're part of the government. So they're state-run media, and that's the counter-argument from the State Department when they do expel journalists whom they say are actually intelligence operatives, which raises all sorts of moral questions and professional questions as well. But I just think a free flow of information. But the greatest challenge is also to fight against the way social media can distort the truth. The propaganda, I know from an academic study that was done at the Annenberg School after the 2016 campaign, that we were actually covering protests and rallies that were fake protests and rallies. They were created, the Black Lives Matter rally in Philadelphia that I covered at Independence Hall when the Clintons were campaigning there. And it turned out that that was one of the examples of people who were just falsely lured in to become players, actors. There was a great deal of that, of Russian interference, as you know, has been well documented. So the advent of social media and the way governments have used social media have created even greater challenges for us as reporters. But in terms of the way we respond, I just think we have to do more and not lose sight of, I mean, when was the last time we really talked about freedom of expression under the Taliban in Afghanistan since the U.S. withdrawal? I mean, we as the collective American media, mass media, and we know what's happened to the women in Afghanistan, and we know the incredible economic crisis. But it really, since the U.S. withdrawal, has, for the most part, gone off the radar. And we focus on getting our Afghan colleagues out and the bureaucracy of that and people trapped in third countries. But we're less concerned about the civil society that we helped create for 20 years, especially of women legislators, judges, human rights activists, teachers, doctors and professors, and journalists, television presenters who've completely lost their careers and are, again, isolated and separated from society.
So obviously, Joe Andrea's raised this, what sometimes feels like a bit of a losing battle against fake news. It seems to be, now with AI and sort of deep fakes and all the rest of it. How do established brands such as ours or trusted media in democratic countries, what do they do to counter this? I mean, the number of times I get asked about it by people who should know better, like, how do I know whether I can trust what you're saying or not, or how do we know what to trust? What on earth do we do in the face of this?
Media literacy is a huge challenge for us. And, by the way, if you're running a misinformation or a disinformation operation, you don't need to have people like Evan living in a foreign country doing firsthand observation and gathering of information. Reporting, on-the-ground reporting, expert journalists who speak the language, who travel, who interview people, who witness things firsthand, who bear witness to events, is a fundamental difference between what quality news organizations do and what the sort of what passes for news information on the internet is. And it requires a broader media literacy to understand that. I think average people think information is information. If I can find it on TikTok or it's surface on Google, it's sure, whatever source that's from, it's as good as anything else. You're right that the sort of the fake news phenomenon and the dismissal, the fundamental value that quality news organizations bring is individual journalists who acquire knowledge and expertise, who travel, who report things firsthand, who take risks to observe events and relate them to a broader audience, is a fundamentally different kind of news and information gathering than anything else you can find on the internet. And until more people understand that, including in the United States, but obviously around the world, journalists are at risk because they're seen as part of an information apparatus that fundamentally can be dismissed and ignored. And that there is an upside. The upside is that the kind of quality information and the fact-checking and the rigorous research and the fact that we have institutions that stand behind what we publish as accurate, as valuable, ultimately will win out at the end of the day in this process. But we're in a very confused period where media literacy is lacking and where the risk that these journalists are taking is not sufficiently recognized by the audience that's benefiting from the information they provide. So I think finding ways to encourage media literacy and finding ways to spread the word about the value and the risks that these journalists are taking on behalf of keeping audiences like this informed is fundamentally in our interest.
So I wonder, Irene, are there initiatives that you know of, educational initiatives or civic society initiatives, to try and promote the idea of the importance of a free press?
Well, what I see increasingly, and I'm advocating for it, is information media and digital literacy from a very young age. And there are countries, the Baltic states, for example, Finland, that are seeking to inoculate their population against Russian disinformation by introducing this kind of literacy in the elementary schools. We have to start. It has to become part of our school curriculum, because that's, we're living in a technologically driven society, and it's going to be more technologically driven for those who are young today. That has to start. I absolutely agree with you. That's empowering the users of news. I think another very good antidote to disinformation is actually free, independent, diverse media. Yeah. Banning media outlets are never the problem to disinformation. It just drives information underground. It just feeds conspiracy theories. And governments must stop producing disinformation themselves. The major source of disinformation, misinformation, are actually the states themselves. That has to end. And governments should call each other out and hold each other accountable for supporting media and supporting credible news.
Well, I think you touched on something of a dilemma there, which maybe you want to comment on, Andrea, which is you talk about free media. I mean, producing trustworthy media from conflict zones, countries where it's difficult to operate, doesn't come cheap. It's very expensive, covering a war, for example. And so newspapers have to fund their newsrooms, and certainly Joe's title and my title, we do that through a paywall, and we're not particularly cheap. I mean, how do you square that circle? You can't. News isn't something you can conjure up out of nothing. We have to charge for it.
No, it's terribly expensive, especially given the security. I mean, to send a team into Syria, the various factions in Syria, with all the risks of kidnapping, and we've seen what's happened. And, Austin Tice has been held for 11 years. And the Wall Street Journal reported today that there are actually talks in Oman with Syrian intelligence to try to get him and several others out, which is incredibly important and encouraging, the first glimmer that we've had in so many years. But Washington Post contributor and freelancer Austin Tice, the expense, and that's something that I think we just all have to rationalize and commit to. And the war in Ukraine has been so expensive for us as an organization that I know that other discretionary things have been changed, that we don't do other things that we would normally do in terms of the expense of certain camera crews and deploying on certain stories and the things that are, less critical than covering the war or being in Afghanistan when we were in full war in Iraq. But there is no other way to cover Ukraine than to be there and to be talking to the people or to try to find out what's happening in Russia.
But Joe, I mean, do you think there's a risk that because we have to charge for people to read our content, there's a risk that trustworthy news organizations end up just talking to a relatively small elite circle of readers, and that this idea that we need to reach a broader audience is stymied by the fact that we also have to pay for the journalism?
I do think that's been, a dilemma for us as we think about needing to support, an expensive news operation and also wanting to reach as many people around the country and around the world as we possibly can. And there are still many tens of millions of people who want and value quality news who are not paying for it at the moment. They may be paying for quality entertainment, but they're not now paying for quality news. And we need to reach more people in order to underscore the value of it and bring them along in a process. We've long since, gone past sort of our core audience of people who, use news as part of their everyday life, for whom it's utterly essential, and tried to reach people who may be curious, but they're not, kind of in a business where they need it kind of live news all the time. And we are reaching more of them, but I would say there's a long road to travel still. And it is important on all of us to find a way to keep quality news available and not have people constantly encounter a paywall when they're looking for it. Because I do think in the long arc of what we're aiming to do, we want to educate a lot more people on the differential value that we bring to our coverage, and we can't do that if we're all closed behind a hard paywall. So we think hard about how to create enough kind of paywall friction, if you will, so that we can support the journalism that we're doing, but not so much that a casual reader who's looking for good quality information on a subject that they care about can't find it from our organizations. So that, the science of that is tricky, but we're trying to get that balance right.
If I could just add here, if we see media freedom, if we see media, good quality journalism as a public service, then I think governments around the world need to figure out a different kind of a financial model, help media find a different kind of financial model than the one that we have right now. I think it's extremely important, whether it's health service, whether it's clean water. I think information, if it is a survival right in the same way as healthcare is or clean water is, then we've got to look at this whole thing differently, whether it's some tax breaks, whether it's some other incentives to make sure that independent quality journalism survives and is accessible to people who need it.
But the problem, of course, is the minute governments get involved, unlike with clean water, there's more, it's a different kettle of fish because the other day we had Elon Musk wanting to describe NPR as a state-run organisation,
right.
the BBC.
Or BBC as a state-run. Absolutely. But that is why we need some global rules. We need some global... Human rights are universal standards, and we need some global rules around this so that everyone, all governments, are willing to pay the game according to the same rules and that they're held accountable. That's, I think, the value that United Nations brings, and we've got to use the UN to push that approach on media.
I would say for us, from our perspective, the single best model that's out there is having the users of quality information be willing to pay something for it, to serve those people directly. The work that we're doing is to serve an end user. We were based in the past on mainly an advertising model with a minority of revenue coming directly from users. We're now based on a model where most of our revenue comes directly from users and a minority from advertising. I like that balance. If we can continue to grow that, we don't want to take money or subsidies from the government. It's not in our mission. I understand there are some quality news organizations that do, but we're heavily invested in getting individual users to pay us something. It's not necessarily a huge amount, but to pay us something less than it costs for Netflix, less than it costs for HBO, to support the journalism that hundreds of people around the world are doing and taking risks for. And to me, that's the long-term bet for quality media.
And some of the revenue that's being diverted to the digital platforms need to come back to media.
Yes.
Oh, that's a whole other path we could go down. Andrea, do you think there's a role for philanthropy in funding free media?
I think there is. Foundations, nonprofits, not political organizations, I'd say, in funding free media, but in partnership, perhaps for documentaries, and through advertising, as they do on the NewsHour, which is a wonderful program on PBS, and my great friend Jim Lehrer and Robin McNeil starting that and carried through by Gwen Ifill, the late Gwen Ifill and Judy Woodruff for so many years, and now carried on, by their successors. So they've proved that. And it's not easy, and I know how much from my friends there, how hard they have to work to keep that flow going, and under at times great attack from government. But they've proved that they can do really solid journalism with what is basically corporate sponsorship.
Yeah, and of course these days as well, the technology also works in our favour in some ways because it's easier to capture the news and to disseminate it as well than it was before. But we've got a few minutes if anybody would like to ask the panel any questions on media freedom or indeed anything else. There's a question over there at the back.
Hi, my name is Giverny. Thank you so much for being here today, first off. I was wondering, you discussed nowadays that people are more likely to invest their money in good quality entertainment rather than good quality journalism. First off, do you think this is because journalism doesn't provide the short-term gratification and satisfaction for a lot of people that they seek through entertainment, watching a show, seeing a TikTok, something like that? Or just general burnout. Unfortunately, due to the current state of the world, a lot of the news that's reported, not because of the journalists themselves, it's not always super positive. Do you think that's caused a burnout among, consumers of journalism? And then what are your companies doing, or you as journalists doing, to try and combat that and get people more interested in journalism and its importance? Thank you.
Well, actually, I'll start with an answer to that. I think you've touched on something that's true, and we know from this report that the Reuters Institute carry out every year. There's a growing number of people who are turning away from the news, and they're called the news avoidance. And every year that percentage, as measured by Reuters, goes up. And I think one answer to it is to promote an idea called solutions-based journalism. I don't know if I'm sure the others on the panel have come across it, which is that rather than just writing about the problems that confront us, you also offer some kind of solution. So it's a movement that's come out of Scandinavia, and they call it constructive news. So the idea is that you don't leave your readers feeling in total despair from consuming your content. I don't know if that's something that the New York Times is also trying.
I think that's one approach. I think one approach is trying to find ways of presenting the journalism and showcasing the expertise that helps people solve problems, as well as alerts them to problems that exist. And I think you see that shift in quality media, where we are watchdogs and we are out there to keep people informed and make them aware of developments, some of them disturbing. But we can also provide a service, and the expertise of our journalists can help in searching for, as you say, solutions to those problems, or at least hosting the debate about what some of those solutions might be, so that people feel they have some agency and some kind of hope on the horizon. I do think that news and entertainment are fundamentally different things, and entertainment has always, frankly, generated greater revenue than news has generated. It's a fairly recent phenomenon that people have had to pay to get quality news. Broadcast news, for example, in the United States, you didn't have to pay for it for years, and some of the revenue streams for broadcast have declined. So I think we're in a process over a generation or more of persuading people that they're not going to get quality information always for free the way they once have expected to, and that education is part of the media literacy that we talked about. It's part of discovering on the internet that you can get quality information or you can get bad information, and you need to distinguish between those two. And the quality information is going to come from reputable providers that need support for the journalism they produce.
And part of it is just the storytelling, finding characters, people involved in solutions or in being watchdogs, or resolving local community problems, interesting characters, good writing, and bringing something new to people. Now, in my part of the industry, we are going through a transformational change just in terms of how we're delivering news and the platforms in which we are. And as broadcast viewership is down, we're transforming to putting everything on streaming, and finding the right balance, and also our digital platforms are, just exploding. With readers want information. They want information about their lives, and it's, yes, the crisis of climate or the economy, but it's also solutions, and it's just finding that mix where people can shop for themselves.
Good. There's another question over there.
Laura Goldman. Laura Goldman. My problem with the news, which I listen to every day, is I think this both side thing gets on my nerves. And I understand where it came from, but is it still relevant today?
Well, Joe.
We very much sort of try not to, fall into the trap of providing literally both sides journalism, in the sense that, you take kind of two conflicting points of view and say, far be it from us to help you try to sort out what is true here, or take something that's untrue and juxtapose it with something that we think actually is accurate. I think that's a little different from saying that we want to be fair and that we want to provide a 360 view of the major issues in the news. I don't think you literally need to do that by quoting opposing points of view and then kind of defaulting to the reader to figure it out for himself or herself what's true. But I do think we as journalists, it's incumbent on us to do the extra work to try to figure out what perspectives there are on the major issues, how we can keep people better educated and open their eyes and not sort of take sides on the issue. So I think we should avoid what you're describing, which is just sort of a default to an old mode of sort of one side says this, the other side says that. But I don't think we can abandon our responsibility to be fair and to look at all sides on the major issues of the time.
Okay, well, look, we're out of time. So just to finish, I want to ask each one of you, 1 or 2 word answers only. What do you see as the greatest threat to freedom of expression? What keeps you awake at night? Andrea?
Authoritarian leaders and governments that misrepresent facts and coat propaganda as though they are real news stories, insidiously, sometimes at home as well as abroad.
Irene?
Public apathy and gullibility.
Good.
Boy, I agree with all of those. I'd just say that the threat to media freedom and literacy goes hand in hand with a global threat to democracy, and you can't see those two things as separate problems. They're interconnected problems, and we have to solve them all together.
Good. Well, look, thank you very much to the panel for this disconcerting conversation.